I'm sorry I don't have a more positive topic or jolly topic today than what I have on the screen. But given that I'm starting my work now as the professor of marketing at the best business school of Finland, I think it's my right and almost a responsibility to give you some of my personal views about the topic on the screen. So given the fact that Finland's economy hasn't really grown at all during the past 15 years, what are the firms themselves and, on the other hand, the government doing wrong? Well, without further ado, let's start by reflecting on what the firms themselves are doing wrong. Well, when thinking about firms as actors, the ultimate responsibility of everything lies with the owners, especially the biggest owners. In Finland, in stock exchange listed companies, the biggest owners are usually pension funds, such as Keva, Varma, Ilmarinen, Elo, and so on. The problem with these big owners is that they almost always remain very silent, kind of fading to the background. They very rarely comment in public on their investments in individual firms. Also, these owners tend to be owners in a wide variety of firms, often even two or more competing firms in the same industry. These two aspects, the fact that the pension insurance companies are very silent in public and the fact that they tend to be owners in almost all big companies, create the impression that the pension funds are indeed satisfied with just silently owning every big firm, irrespective of whether these firms have any growth ambitions at all. Now, if the biggest owners don't seem to care about the firm's growth ambitions, it's no wonder that the firms themselves don't have any growth ambitions either. Well, when it comes then to the privately owned companies, such as family companies, the problem is quite similar. As a background, many of these families are used to living their comfortable life enabled by steady dividend flows from the companies. Well, this is understandable because the families are used to living this comfortable life, and the underlying problem compared to, for instance, American and Swedish firms is that too many of these families are quite satisfied with the status quo, but very few of these families and entrepreneurs, way too few, have the ambition to actually become very rich. And when almost all the privately owned companies are owned by families and individuals who are not very eager to become rich, again, it's no wonder that the companies do not either, again, tend to make any big ambitious growth plans. Besides the biggest owners, the boards of directors aren't without blame either. At the outset, when the big owners don't have any ambitions to grow, the boards nominated by the big owners don't, of course, have such ambitions either. Another problem is a more personal one. Board members in Finnish firms are usually much more concerned about holding and keeping their board seats than they are about making the firms grow. The problem is worsened by the fact that the board members don't actually have any financial incentives to make the firms grow and take risks. Unlike CEOs, board members don't have any so-called golden parachutes waiting for them if they take risk and fail. Indeed, for instance, CEOs can take more risk because if they fail and get fired, they get a handsome cash compensation, which is called the golden parachutes. But because board members don't have such a golden parachutes, they don't want to take risks in making the firms grow either. Then when it comes to company executives, the problem is not so much in the unwillingness to take risks and invest. After all, the CEOs have their golden parachutes, as well as they are also usually people who are ambitious people who have the kind of like a drive to grow their firm. What company executives are doing wrong is actually something in the area of traditional marketing. First, unlike in many other countries, executives in Finland think that marketing is only the advertising and PR and does not include, for instance, product and service development and design. This leads to an approach where the company's engineers first develop a product and then they ask the marketing or sales department of the company to advertise and sell the product to customers and export it to foreign markets. Well, instead, what the firm should be doing is to take the perspective of the end customers and global markets into account already very early in the concept creation stage of the product and service development, before any engineering of the new product even starts. Well, this way, many firms in other countries, for instance Sweden, have been able to build so-called born global companies with product, service and brand concepts which appeal to global customers and audiences from the day one. Well, now I'm moving on from what firms are doing wrong into what the Finnish government is doing wrong. Well, there are of course many levels to the government. Let's begin at the grassroots level, meaning government agencies and local administrative authorities. In a recent study, I found with my colleagues that over 50% of Finnish large companies agreed with the following statement, I quote, "The sluggish and rigid bureaucratic processes of government agencies significantly reduce our firms' willingness to make investments." Well, perhaps the most striking example of this problem is a case related to BASF, the German-based multinational firm. In 2018, BASF announced that it will build a factory for battery materials worth hundreds of millions in Harjavalta in western Finland. Well, first all went well, and BASF received an environmental permit from the local authorities. The plant's construction started and it was finished in 2022. However, while the factory was being built, the local administrative court suddenly cancelled the environmental permit. As a result, BASF had to apply for another permit. Well, they got it, but then they were again sued back to the court. Well, to date, 7 years after the project was started and 3 years after the factory was already ready, BASF still hasn't been able to start the factory in full. Well, this is of course a very extreme case, but there are hundreds and thousands of smaller cases in Finland every year where the sluggishness of government agencies, bureaucracy is making investments of both smaller and larger firms difficult and actually sometimes even impossible. Well, then to the national government. Well, here I see many problems which are all basically due to the fact that the government and basically all the political parties from left to right are making a number of false assumptions about the behavior of firms. One false assumption is that a clearly lower corporate tax rate would not motivate firms to make more growth investments. To understand that this is a false assumption, you only have to take a look at a list of world countries ranked by the GDP per capita. If you exclude micro countries like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, so the list is nowadays topped by Ireland. Well, the thing is that Ireland has had for the past 20 years or so one of the lowest corporate tax rates in Europe, about 12%. And during the same time, Ireland has climbed from somewhere around position 30 on the GDP per capita list in the 1990s to number 1 in the 2020s. A second false assumption the government is making is that only the export and manufacturing industries would matter for the growth of the economy, while domestic retail and service industries or sectors would not be that important. Again, the falsehood of this assumption becomes clear when you take a look at statistics. According to statistics, actually the value added that exports create for Finland's GDP is only about 20% of the GDP. In other words, 80% of Finland's GDP is still created by other economic activities than exports and other industries than traditional export industries such as manufacturing. Also, in many of our role model countries such as Denmark or Germany, Great Britain, the domestic retail and service industries are much more recognized as an important engines for economic growth besides the traditional export industries. A third false assumption relates to the previous one. The Finnish government, especially the parties in the current government, seem to refuse to accept that the fact that the major part of the stronger economic growth of, for instance, Sweden has been created by immigrants. Remember that GDP is basically calculated by multiplying the labor hours worked by a country's people with labor productivity. In countries like Sweden and Finland, where the labor productivity doesn't grow that much, the GDP mostly only grows if the current population works for more hours or if new people like immigrants move in and start working. Well, as our current population, we don't want to work for more hours. The remaining key to GDP growth is actually immigration. So in Sweden, the GDP grew by over 40% between 2019 and 24, whereas in Finland the growth was half of that, or less than half of that, 18%. During the same time, Sweden welcomed way more than 1 million new immigrants, and Finland only about a couple of 100,000. From this perspective, for instance, the True Finn Party's negative attitude toward immigrants is not only morally appalling, but it's also a gross underestimation of the power of immigrants to contribute to Finland's economic growth. Well, finally, at the level of the EU, there are a number of problems too. Well, I only have time for one problem anymore, so let's do that. The problem is that the EU and its competition authorities have traditionally prevented large European firms from merging or acquiring each other, merging together or acquiring each other. This is one reason for why in the EU we don't have so many giant tech companies, for instance, as in the USA. So if the EU wants its economy to grow and to achieve so-called sovereignty, it should start encouraging rather than blocking the mergers and acquisitions between European tech companies. For instance, encouraging the merger of Nokia and Ericsson would result in a rare Europe-based tech giant that would dominate the global industry. This way, actually, Nokia could become again the new Nokia of Finland. Not that bad. Now I've come to the end of my list of the problems and what the Finnish government as well as the firms are doing wrong. And I think that my speech already gave you between the lines some tips about what should be done differently. But to conclude this speech, here's still a recap. Big owners in companies should more publicly vouch for growth and prioritize investments in firms which have big growth ambitions. Owners should also provide better financial incentives to boards of directors to take more risks with growth investments. Company executives should introduce the customer marketing perspective at early stages of product and service development, as well as to design new product services and brands to the global audiences and markets from the very beginning. Government agencies and local authorities should smoothen out their processes and lighten or remove bureaucracy. And of course, the national government should provide more resources to the local agencies and authorities to get rid of this slow and sluggish bureaucracy. The national government and all political parties should pay much more attention to domestic service and retail industries, in addition to the traditional manufacturing and export industries. And it's about the time that the national government also acknowledges that immigrants are totally critical for our economic growth. Finally, the government should consider dropping the corporate tax rate from the planned 18 to 15 or under. That's it. Thank you.